Okay, so thanks everyone for coming. Today we have Sam Silva. Sorry, I need to look at my notes. He's currently an assistant professor in the Department of Earth Sciences and the Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering at the University of Southern California. So today he's going to be talking to us about physically regularized machine learning emulation of aerosol activation. So if you want to take it away, you can hear.
Great. Yeah, thank you. And just one note, the building I'm in right now has been doing this very, very fun thing where sometimes the internet just stops and there's no warning, and it's a stochastic process that no one can predict. So if there are issues with connectivity or I need to repeat anything, please let me know. That's just the way it goes with Zoom. So I'd appreciate that. So great. Yeah, I'm Sam Silva. I'm an assistant professor at the University of Southern California, and I'd like to get right into it. So first, I just want to acknowledge some collaborators at this work. This is work that started when I was a data scientist at the Pacific Northwest National Lab and has since continued into my time here at USC. I've had a bunch of great collaborators. They're listed here. Who've been helpful in a variety of different contexts from both the national labs, universities, and private companies. So to get started, the research that we do in my group is really all about atmospheric chemistry and composition, and mostly because we're very interested in why the chemical composition of the atmosphere and how the chemical composition of the atmosphere is relevant to two modern environmental crises, air quality and climate change. And today I'm going to be discussing some work we've been doing focusing on the climate aspect of this major research focus. So I don't need to really spend too much time on this. I think for this audience, we all are broadly motivated by studying climate. But just to broadly state, right, the impacts of climate change are large and far-reaching. I'm showing here the CO2 concentration with respect to time from about 1960 to roughly present day at Mauna Loa. You see this stark increase in CO2 concentrations, and associated with that has been a large change in the Earth system, from changes to acute extreme events like severe weather, as well as longer-term changes to the environmental state, leading to impacts like drought and so on. And the important thing to note about this, and the thing that is really relevant to my work, is that or atmospheric composition is a real primary driver of climate change. So what you're looking at here is a figure from the IPCC in 2021. Every time the IPCC comes out, they have a version of this figure, and everyone in the atmospheric composition community gets really excited and wants to be the first one to post it to Twitter, so you get the most likes and retweets and all of that good stuff. But what you're looking at is the simulated temperature contribution from a variety of radiative forcing agents. This is a temperature contribution, the change in temperature from 2019 relative to 1750. And on the y-axis, you see various climate forcing agents. Carbon dioxide is on the top, well-mixed greenhouse gases is below, ozone, water vapor, albedo, aerosol, and so on. And they're split by natural and anthropogenic sources. And the real key take-home point here is that nearly all of these processes or all of these factors, these forcing agents on the y-axis, are tied in some way to the chemical composition of the atmosphere. And so a major research question that we're trying to get after in my group, and I know many on this call are also interested in this, is how we can use data science and machine learning methods to address problems in Earth system science research, how we can design better computational systems and gain more insight from data. And in particular, with respect to the image I showed on the previous slide, really interested in how we can use machine learning to address some of the uncertainties, some of the error bars associated with the overall magnitudes predicted here. And it's worth noting that for aerosol, and in particular aerosol-cloud interactions, the error bar is the largest, right? So this is the largest error bar in terms of the impact of the forcing agent on the total change in surface temperature. And so in many respects, aerosol and aerosol-cloud interactions are the largest or one of the largest uncertainties in our understanding of the physical climate system. And so we're really interested in trying to reduce that uncertainty through a variety of means. And one particular process that we're interested in that has garnered a lot of attention for being a potential cause of some of this uncertainty is a process known as aerosol activation, right? So the direct formation of cloud droplets through condensation of liquid water alone is thermodynamically very unfavorable in the atmosphere. And it turns out that nearly all cloud droplets form through heterogeneous interactions with aerosol in the atmosphere. And the process by which this happens is aerosol ultimately can become suitable for cloud droplets to form on them through a process known as activation. And that is really what we're interested in here. It's a critical component of aerosol cloud interactions and really initiates the vast majority of the aerosol cloud interactions that happen in the overall Earth system. So it turns out that numerically simulating all of the processes relevant to aerosol activation, which occurs on the scale of an individual aerosol and matter and things like microscale, surface tension and chemistry and so on are very relevant. But trying to simulate that in a climate model with grid spacings of hundreds of kilometers is far too computationally expensive to be routinely used in global climate model simulations. And so instead, we've developed a variety of parameterizations. These parameterizations are skillful and fast, but there are known limitations. And these are some of the limitations that I have been very interested in over the past couple of years, focused on this work. When you run these parameterizations in models and then compare them to a detailed but slow parameterization, you find that that many models have parameterizations that are fairly low. And this is an example from the DOE's Earth System Model E3SM. The parameterization they're using for aerosol activation, for those of you who are super into this stuff, is the Abdul-Razak and Gann ARG scheme. This is a very widely used parameterization, and it predicts the fraction of aerosol in a given location that are activated and are then able to form cloud droplets and participate in aerosol cloud interactions in some interesting ways. So this is a value that ranges from 0 to 1. And you see the parameterization is shown here on the left. And the difference between the parameterization and a truth is in quotes, this is a truth as a detailed parcel model that has the latest and greatest physics and chemistry, but is slow. Right? You can see the difference between those two is that in general, the parameterization tends to be biased low, and it tends to be biased low in particular over certain regions like East Asia, where there are very high aerosol concentrations. And this is a well-known limitation of this scheme. And so what we were interested in is if we could develop high quality machine learning parameterizations to help address this issue, right? I think trying to address limitations in Earth system models is something that a lot of folks affiliated with LEAP have been interested in from a machine learning perspective, and we definitely took inspiration from the work of some of the folks who are here on this call. So to start with, we wanted to work with a case study, some offline data that was relatively simple to handle and relatively simple to work with, to even demonstrate that this technique could even work in this case, because of course, machine learning for prediction doesn't always work in all cases. And so we wanted to start with something simple and offline. And here, what we're interested in using is the differences in prediction between a detailed cloud parcel model. This is a detailed but slow model that could not be used in an Earth system model, but has the latest and greatest physics, and compare that with the parameterization numerical approximation from the Abdul-Razak and Gann scheme. This is what I showed on the previous slide. And we want to predict the fraction of aerosol activated. And the performance of that original scheme is shown here on in this figure, where on the x-axis you have what we are considering the truth here. This is the detailed but slow model. And on the y-axis we have the existing parameterization. Right? This quantity varies from 0 to 1 because we're predicting a fraction of aerosol in a given location that are activated. And you can see broadly that the parameterization tends to do a fairly decent job. The 1-to-1 line is shown as red, the 2-to-1 lines are shown in blue. In general, we cluster pretty closely on that 1-to-1 line with some reasonably substantial spread. And so we were interested if machine learning methods could do a better job. And to do this, we were using a data-driven modeling approach, where we take some input data, use that to drive a data-driven model, estimate some output quantity, compare our estimated output to what the true value is, and use that difference to refine the parameters in a data-driven model. This is essentially just training in a machine learning model context. Here, we're using model input variables. So these are our input variables that would be simulated in an Earth system model. Using that, for most of this talk, I'm going to talk about deep learning regression models, but we did try some other machine learning techniques as well. Use that to predict the fraction of aerosol activated, this act frac value, compare that with the truth, and then use that difference to refine all of the parameters within our deep learning regression model. Now, what that actually looks like from a structural perspective is our input variables are things like aerosol size, number, hygroscopicity, and vertical velocity. And our prediction, or the output, is the fraction of aerosol activated. And the neural network we used was a fairly small neural network with 3 hidden layers. And then each node, of course, computes a nonlinear activation function on top of some linear operations. So again, we take as input variables parameters related to the meteorological state that we know drive aerosol activation. So these are the inputs to the actual parameterization as they would exist in an Earth system model. We predict the fraction of aerosol activated. And the reason being is because we actually want to use this online in an Earth system model, right? We're not just interested in training this method to just show that in this toy example, we can develop good predictions. We actually want to get this online into the E3SM or in other Earth system models as well. And then we use a ReLU activation function. It looks like there's something in the chat, but I'll try to open up that and see if I can answer a question. So yeah, Jerry Lynn asks, how do we decide on this architecture? I can talk about hyperparameter tuning later on, but essentially this particular architecture, we use the Keras tuner hyperparameter optimization package. And I think we used hyperband search parameters. In fact, I know we used hyperband, and I searched across a wide variety of ranges here. But the architecture that we chose was indeed a trade-off between keeping the model reasonably small, because at inference time, a very large model still takes some amount of time to predict. And we need this to be fast if we're going to use it in an Earth system model, which when I ask all the folks in the model development team if I can have half the compute devoted to my one deep learning regression model, they said no. So they you need to keep things reasonably quick. And so please let me know if I miss anything else that popped into the chat. I'm not super excellent at monitoring that in real time. So of course, with a regression model such as this, what you really need is sufficient data to optimize all the different weights and biases. And to do that, we were able to artificially generate as much data as we wanted. In this initial test case, and in the paper I sent along, we generated 20,000 realizations of the slow but detailed parcel model using Latin hypercube sampling across the input space, so across realistic aerosol size and aerosol number distributions, realistic hygroscopicity, and so on and so forth. Again, the goal is to predict the activation fraction with inputs of aerosol and meteorological parameters. And the real take-home message is, of course, that this works, right? I'll show that first on this slide with, again, this is a figure that you've seen before. This is the existing parameterization that's widely used in many Earth system models, with the parameterization on the y-axis and the truth, as we're saying it here, on the x-axis. And we compare that to something like a deep neural network, you see that you get significantly better performance, right? I want to note that we've tried other emulator methods as well, and I'll touch a bit on those in the coming slides. But what we're really interested in here is that this was fairly straightforward, right? This deep neural network that we trained was not particularly challenging to construct, and we had some more time on the project, and we were really interested in how we could improve this accuracy even further. And in particular, how we could improve the accuracy further, but still end up with a neural network or machine learning approach that could be easily integrated into a modern Fortran-based Earth system model. So what does that mean? That means that really advanced techniques, complex model architectures with various skip connections and recurrence and spatial awareness and so on, those can give you very, very good predictions. But actually getting that online into a Fortran-based Earth system model is a really big challenge. And the tools for that are still being developed, and I think should be developed and should be supported, because I think that's one of the big challenges we'll be facing. And I'll touch more on that in a little bit as well. So what we were interested in is just this process of implicit regularization through known physics, right? In the sort of broad sense, regularization is a process of adding information in order to help solve an ill-posed problem or prevent overfitting. There are a bunch of ways to do this, and here we are interested in this from changing the way in which we predict from this what we term sort of physically naive approach. This is the typical way that I have used machine learning in my own research, and many of us do, in the earth sciences, where we take some set of inputs, use that to drive a machine learning prediction model and predict some quantity. In this physically regularized approach, as we've called it here, you first calculate a quantity that you're interested in, and then on top of that, run a machine learning approach to help get you more closer to the truth. Other ways of thinking about this could be residual learning, bias correction learning, hybrid learning, and so on. The important thing here is that this is a very straightforward technique to implement in a modern Earth system model, right? We already have in Earth system models ways to calculate the activation fraction using existing knowledge, using the ARG scheme here that I described previously. And so all we're doing is we're taking that calculation and then adding to it some prediction from the machine learning model approach to get us a better overall prediction of the quantity that we care about here, which is the activation fraction. I want to note that there are, of course, far more advanced ways to add physical information into neural networks. I have some students working on that in my group. Tom Buchler and others have done a really fantastic job of this. But this was our sort of first approach to get something that we could actually work with in a model development space. And the key take-home message here is that adding this physical information improves the parameterization predictive skill, right? So now on the left, you're seeing the base deep neural network, and what I just popped in is the deep neural network as regularized in this language by the ARG scheme. And you can see a much tighter fit, much closer to that one-to-one line, and things tend to look much better. Now, it's worth noting, and I'm happy to be able to talk to a group of people who are very interested in machine learning and learning in general, so I can get into these gory details that sometimes I avoid, is that the quality of the physical information that you add matters, and model classification, model type still matters. So what you're looking at here now is a similar set of figures, but just multiple panels with the emulator prediction on the y-axis and the parcel model truth, right, this detailed but slow model on the x-axis for three different model types for this ARG regularization. The first is just a linear regression with multiple linear regression with a ridge penalty, that is to keep the to try to deal with issues associated with autocorrelation and any individual coefficient getting too large. Then XGBoost boosted regression trees, and the deep neural network that you saw before. And you can see that the high capacity nonlinear approaches like XGBoost and a neural network tend to perform better than the ridge regression. However, we can still get pretty good prediction with just a linear ridge correction there. It looks like Marcus asked if the outliers are from the physical or the neural network model. The outliers that we're predicting in this regularized approach are first from, we're predicting the outliers or the residuals from the ARG scheme. I'm not sure if I entirely understand your question. You can, of course, chime in and just chat as well if you'd like. Again, so what I've shown here is this regularization from the ARG scheme, but we have other ways of predicting aerosol activation. And one that I was really excited about was using techniques from a paper that was published in the 1950s from Sean Toomey, so famous for the Toomey effect. This is a very, very simple power law relationship to try to calculate the aerosol that are activated. It is unbounded, meaning in the positive direction, meaning that it can predict anywhere from 0 aerosol are activated to infinite aerosol are activated. This, of course, presents some issues in the fact that there are not infinite aerosol in a given location. And you can see that this relatively quite simple and quite crude approximation from the 1950s does not provide the additional benefit for prediction that the existing parameterizations do. In particular, you can see, for example, the linear correction predicting far outside of the bounds of 0 to 1, which, of course, in terms of a fraction, violates conservation of mass. The last thing I'll say about the details of a lot of the ML underneath the hood is that the impact of this regularization decreases with model complexity, right? I'm showing that here for now the mean squared error on the y-axis and model complexity on the x-axis. Here, this is just constraining the number of trees that we allow in this boosted regression approach. And as you increase model complexity, the difference between the ARG regularized model shown in black and the model with no regularization shown in red, these things tend to converge, right? This makes sense because as the model grows, the overall capacity of the model to predict some complex nonlinear functions grows as well, right? So this was nice to see that as we let our models get huge, we don't really need this extra simple physical information in the beginning. But it's worth noting that we don't necessarily want our models to get huge because we want to use this online in an Earth system model. And the bigger the model, the slower it is at inference time for the same, this sort of a big, broad hand-wavy statement. But larger models tend to be slower at inference time, which is something that we care deeply about avoiding. And so we can get away with a slightly smaller model for better predictions at smaller models, which is good for getting things online. So taking a step back, right, I showed this slide before that adding physical information can improve parameterization predictive skill. And I want to dig into that statement a little bit, right? What do we mean about improving parameterization predictive skill? One thing in particular is that you notice in the basic neural network approach, we tend to have this weird kink down near very low activation fractions, right? If you zoom in on that, you can see here that in the basic neural network, we actually overestimate quite a lot in these very, very low, now between 0 and 0.1, this is just zooming in on those axes, we overestimate quite a bit, but by adding, by this bias correction approach, we pretty much correct for that almost entirely. Another interesting feature is that if you take the training data set that we use and then just continue to sample it out with your temperature range going 4 Kelvin warmer, this is sort of a pseudo generalizability test, right? This is not perfectly satisfying. This is not saying an exact assessment of how it would perform in a warmer climate, but this is getting us toward that question. You can show how the base deep neural network performs in a 4 Kelvin warmer case. Again, fairly good, but adding this physical information gets you much closer and much more bang on to that 1-to-1 line. And so this helps lend confidence to the fact that in the case that if we were to use this online in an Earth system model and use it for extrapolation as opposed to interpolation, we would likely have more confidence in the model that includes some of this physical information underneath the hood. And while we don't want ideally all of our methods would be interpolating in the online machine learning space, it is unlikely that we can generate sufficiently large training data for all possible use cases of Earth system models that they will never extrapolate, right? So it is still good to check this sort of thing. So a big question we've had is, what does this actually look like in a real climate model, right? I spent all this time caveating a bunch of these statements about, we actually want to develop something that we can get online in an Earth system model. And that has been the bulk of our work over the past year and a half since this initial paper was published. And to get at this first, we just want to implement the base deep neural network into the Department of Energy's Earth system model, E3SM. And we did that using the Fortran to Keras bridge that was led by a student, partially supervised by Mike Pritchard, Jordan Ott. And when you do that, this is, I think, probably the most exciting result of my entire time working at the Pacific Northwest National Lab, is a figure where two figures that look the same, right? What we find is that in putting the base deep neural network activation scheme online into the Energy Exascalar System Model E3SM does not crash in a real climate simulation. So what you're looking at is the precipitation rate for the annual average for a 1-year simulation with the base deep neural network on top and E3SM, the DOE's climate model, on the bottom. And these maps look very, very similar with only minor differences. For those of you who have actually tried to get machine learning approaches online in an Earth system model, you know that this result is not a trivial result to get, right? It's very easy to blow up the model with your machine learning technique. And I think there are a couple of reasons why our approach was successful that lends itself towards this type of approach and makes this a little bit easier than what some of my colleagues doing things like subgrid cloud physics have struggled with. And one is that this problem is explicitly bounded, right? All predictions have to fall between 0 and 1. And so we can just clip any poor predictions to set them immediately to between 0 and 1. And that really helps fix things from blowing up hugely. I also want to note that runtime differences are reasonably negligible between these two simulations. So, if you get slightly different nodes, you're going to get much different simulation times than using these different approaches. So while the basic prototype works, it is imperfect. And this is particularly as it relates to what we know about the number of cloud droplets in the atmosphere. So when an aerosol is activated to form a cloud droplet, more activation will generally lead to increased cloud droplet numbers. And what you're looking at here is the column integrated cloud droplet number concentration for the base deep neural network approach in that same model simulation. You can see large numbers of cloud droplets, for example, over East Asia. And if you compare that to the original version of E3SM, you see significantly fewer cloud droplets almost everywhere. And the difference between the two, which is shown on the bottom panel here, shows that by using this online approach, we get a massive increase in cloud droplets everywhere. Now, we don't know if this is correct, and we know that there are some limitations in our case study that I described earlier, right? This sort of offline convenience approach. And so we wanted to make this more realistic and more representative of the conditions in which it would be used. And so to do that, we updated our training data strategy in particular. First, we just updated E3SM to the latest and greatest version of that model and improved the generator of data to consider multiple aerosol modes, whereas before we were just considering one type of aerosol, ammonium sulfate, and to account for additional processes in our emulation target. So for the detailed and slow model, now we're adding additional processes into that to help account for all of the physics that we want to have contained there. And then importantly here, we changed our sampling strategy from Latin hypercube sampling in the input distribution space to a real climate model distribution sampling. So we actually ran E3SM and output all of the parameters from all of the input parameters from E3SM, as opposed to just random sampling across this entire space. And I've just shown what Latin hypercube sampling might look like for a 2-parameter distribution. Latin hypercube sampling is in gray. It samples the whole entire space, whereas our real distribution might actually be fairly correlated and what's shown in red. What this does is it certainly biases our prediction to be better in this red regime, right? However, that's what we want, right? We want our neural network to work online in a climate model. We don't necessarily care if it makes good predictions in spaces of input parameters that have no bearing on reality on Earth, right? So extremely cold temperatures, extremely high pressures, and extremely high vertical velocities. It's sort of parts of that input distribution, that joint distribution, that are not physical. And so we don't want to weight those predictions very high. It turns out that having this more realistic aerosol treatment and a more realistic problem is much harder to emulate because it's a more complex model. So here, you're looking at the ARG prediction scheme. Again, this is just the existing parameterization for this real scenario. And you can see that things are a lot messier, right? This is much less tidy around that one-to-one line, and I have much less confidence in existing parameterizations knowing in this specific use case, right? So using this real online model, you see a lot more complexity. And when you use the deep neural network approach with all that we can give it, you get significantly better predictions, but still not as good as the nice, convenient case study that we published earlier. And I think that this is a really important result, right? That, of course, developing these contrived case study examples that can help tell you if a technique is even worth getting after is a really important thing to do. But then reapplying your technique where the rubber meets the road in a real Earth system model, things can get far more complex and a little bit more, far more difficult to really work with. However, when we get this online into E3SM, we do get a more realistic climate. Here I'm showing column integrated number concentration of cloud droplets. Again, I showed this figure before, but when you compare that to the newer version of E3SM, we still see an increase in cloud droplets, which is consistent with the increase in activation, but it's less of an enormous increase. And this is good to know because when we start comparing this to satellite observations, we get better agreement overall in that space. And so the big lessons learned, I think, from this approach so far are that these physical regularization approaches are a simple and effective strategy for improving machine learning parameterization performance. And so if you have an existing parameterization or existing method in your Earth system model that you want to improve upon, maybe removing the entire thing and replacing it with a neural network is not the best approach. And instead, using a small neural network or a small machine learning method to actually just bias correct can be a better approach. And this is something that, of course, other people have found in various nudging studies from the Allen Institute folks, for example, have found similar results. As with all ML applications, I think training data really is key, and reforming our problem for the training data in the real Earth system model has really shown, I think, some striking results. And also just getting these things to run online is a significant challenge, right? Building this case study where pretty much everything could be hacked together on my laptop or on an individual GPU was quite nice and convenient for working through this, but getting things online in a real Fortran-based Earth system model has been a really big significant challenge that we've dealt with. And to sort of gloss past this as we put this online, but really that's 6 months of work or as much time as it took to do the entire first half of the project. And so the next steps, and what we're actually doing right now, what's running online in the background, is to fully assess the new emulator against observations. So going back to this slide here, right, does this new climate, as predicted by the ARG regularized DNA, does this match our satellite observations of clouds, cloud droplets, things like effective radius, and so on? Does it have better agreement than the prior version, right? Does this help us, right? Because we know that we're getting a better prediction of the activation process. So we've reduced that structural uncertainty in our model, but that doesn't mean that we're necessarily going to get better agreement of cloud properties, because this is very complex. And of course, compensating errors can exist all over the place. And so it's not necessarily true in my mind that improving the prediction of an individual process makes your model better with respect to observations. You have to actually do that assessment and make sure that that's true. And hopefully we'll learn something interesting about the model along the way. So I want to just briefly kind of plug the other types of work that I'd be happy to chat about as well, if folks are interested, that we do in my group, including using some explainable and interpretable methods for understanding model processes, whether that's the physics of light in plant canopies or lightning occurrence worldwide, and errors in that prediction, as well as using field observations directly for model parameterization development. We did this as it relates to the loss of tropospheric oxidants to vegetation. And then lastly, a major effort that we've been focusing on right now in my research group, I have a couple of students working on this now, is just using some of these data science methods for model development and understanding, in particular as it relates to applications of graph theory and network analysis to try to understand atmospheric chemical reactions. And I have a bunch of, overall, this big conclusion that some of these data science and machine learning methods can improve predictability is something that I think is really exciting, and I'm very interested in pursuing further, but there's a lot more work to do, including some work that if you will be at, for example, conferences like AGU, and in the fall, you will see students like a student in my group, Kaylee Butler, looking at aerosol-cloud interactions from an observational perspective and seeing if we can use some dimensionality reduction techniques to understand why modern Earth system models are wrong. A soon-to-be graduated student looking at the impacts of vegetation on the atmosphere in Los Angeles. So as the city decides to add trees everywhere, what will actually happen? I know Joe Coe, who's in the audience, knows quite a bit about this. A superstar undergraduate who worked with me for 11 weeks and has already submitted a manuscript looking at novel neural network architectures. So instead of feed-forward neural networks, what if we add skip connections everywhere and sort of randomly wire these things? This is taken in part from some really great work that Andrew Geis at PNNL has done. And we're using this for climate model emulation. And Will is truly remarkable. I feel like I'm supposed to plug him as a superstar that everyone should try to recruit, but I also have this slight motivation to not do that, so he comes to stay in my group. But actually, in reality, it's fantastic to get to work with such great students. And then Obenstern is another student in my group, looking at just the numerical methods for simulating atmospheric chemistry, and how turns out there's some surprising results of the chemistry being the slowest at sunrise and sunset. Maybe it's not surprising if there's any heterogeneous chemists in the audience, but it was fun to see for me. So overall, just want to say thank you. I hope to keep this a little bit short because I have to dip out and I want to have time for questions before leaving. I do want to note that if you know anyone who wants to come live in Los Angeles, which is the best city in America, especially in the winter, I am recruiting, and I'd love to chat. So thank you. All right, so a question in the chat is from Jerry Lynn asking to explain the ARG method again. And I actually think I can. I have a slide here that might make it make a little bit more sense. Let's see if I can move the chat. So what we're doing with this regularization approach is I think it's helpful to contrast this with the sort of traditional approach we use for in machine learning, which is where we want to predict some quantity here, the fraction of aerosol activated between 0 and 1, and we use just some machine learning function of some inputs, x. Instead, what we're doing is we're predicting the activation fraction by first calculating the activation fraction predicted by the ARG scheme, and then calculating an additional term from a machine learning approach as a function of those inputs to ultimately help us get a slightly better prediction, right? So you can imagine this as an implicit regularization, right? This is not directly changing the optimization or anything like that. Or you could imagine this as bias correction. We're actually just training a machine learning bias corrector. I hope that helps.
I have a question. Can you hear me, Sam?
Yes.
This is Marcus. My question was about I mean, there's only like a few points on those one-to-one lines that are kind of set off it.
Yeah.
But is the error in those mostly a function of the base physical model, or is it in the error? Is it in the bias correction of the physical model?
Okay. Yeah. That's a really interesting question, right? So are we just doing a bad job of bias correction, or are we, or is the bias correction actually driving us further from the truth? I don't actually have an answer to that. I can tell you what these errors look like from the input parameter distribution. And in particular, we tend to find the worst performance over very low hygroscopicity values. This is corrected for the most in using the ARG scheme, but there are still challenges there. So I don't actually have a specific, I didn't pull out individual outliers and say, are these, where does this error mostly come from? So, but my hunch is that it comes from incorrect, the sort of bad predictions from the neural network approach in areas that are relatively poorly sampled or surprising for the network to see.
And then I have another question if nobody else has one right now. With using the climatological distribution of environmental variables, are you worried that changes under like changing climate, that you'll be going sort of out of sample? Is there a need to sort of combine that with like a limited Latin hypercube or something like that?
Yeah. So that's actually a really interesting question. I think in our case, we ran the model for exactly when we wanted to use it, and then are looking only at regions very similar to that, right? But if we wanted to run this for 150 years, we're likely to get out of sample, and that can cause some, actually, I'm not gonna go to it, that can cause some pretty substantial issues, right? I think an ideal approach would be, ideal meaning if you had the resources to actually maintain this type of parameterization, is to make sure that your training data is generated effectively on a per use case basis, right? Now, of course, that's very unrealistic to retrain everything in your model for any scenario that you're interested in. And so I do think that maybe something like a limited Latin hypercube sampling is a good idea. We propose doing something like that, of basically saying, augmenting our training data set with sampling from slightly outside of that distribution. Or another strategy is just to broadly think about, what is the actual role of machine learning emulators in an Earth system model, right? If they are so sensitive to training data, maybe they're better used in studies like the one we've done, where we're really trying to assess model structural uncertainty, than a world where a huge amount of our model is a huge, amount of the model code and model processes just comes from neural networks that have no real guarantee that they'll perform well out of sample.
Hi, Sam. This is Kara.
Hi.
I had a question. For your satellite, for the work that you're doing now with satellites, are you planning to like tune the model in some way, or is it like, what exactly is, or can you talk more about what your plan is with the satellite observation and the comparisons?
Yeah, so we have a variety of satellite observations of cloud properties, including things like cloud fraction, effective radius, and other parameters from for example, MODIS. And what we really want to do is just see if in the limited way in which you can use these satellite observations to really assess climate models, right? Understanding all of those caveats, are we getting closer to observations by using the improved aerosol activation scheme or not? And I think what this will really tell us is how, if we're confident that our activation scheme is correct or more correct, but we don't actually do a better job of reproducing observations, that can tell us a lot about where to put our efforts for improving model development, and can tell us something about potentially compensating errors that exist in the model as we have it, right? Because I think, oh, go ahead.
I guess like what types of metrics will you use to compare, like things like cloud fraction, or I mean, I guess maybe that's part of the study, is like figuring out what are the appropriate metrics.
Yeah, and there's I think literature on the ways in which these things have historically been done. I think what you might be getting at is that it's not a trivial one-to-one comparison, right? We're not using everything doesn't work perfectly, and once you start nudging, you start to break some of the physics, and so it's hard to really assess things, and that's something that we're struggling with right now. Fortunately, some of the collaborators at PNNL who I'm working with have done this quite a bit. This cloud process assessment is something that's a little bit new for me from a satellite perspective, so it is something that I'm still learning. But yeah, I think to first order, there are a variety of approaches that you can use to assess these. There's a question in the chat. Jerry Lynn asks, to bound the neural network predictions between 0 and 1, do we use a special activation layer at the end? So what this is getting at is your final layer of your neural network for regression approaches commonly has a linear activation function, right? Where it can just predict any value between negative infinity and infinity. But since we know our predictions should range between 0 and 1, you could implicitly use something like a sigmoid activation function that always predicts between 0 and 1. As it turns out, using a sigmoid activation function gets you slightly worse predictions out to like the 7th decimal place. And so we just went with the linear activation function and then just clipped the value in Fortran, right? So the maximum that this can be is whatever it's predicted, or 1. The minimum it can be is whatever it's predicted, or 0.
Anybody else have any other questions?
Hey Sam, I have a quick question actually.
Yeah.
So if I'm remembering correctly, I think the XGBoost performed like in your simple analysis performed like on par with the neural network.
Yeah.
So I was wondering if you kind of if you did, why you had a preference to implement the neural network online.
Yeah. So there are two main reasons for this. And I'll say two, but really the biggest reason is just that there are tools available for getting feed-forward neural networks online into Fortran models reasonably easily, right? This was really just are there existing software techniques to get this working well? And then at the time that we started this, getting something like XGBoost into Fortran was not identified as something that was particularly feasible. Additionally, timing tests showed that the neural network approach, given the number of parameters we've had and the way that you can just do matrix multiplication very quickly, the neural network approach was faster. And so for roughly similar accuracy, or even slightly worse accuracy, the neural network was preferred from the sort of challenges of getting things online.
Got it. Thank you.
Right. But I think this broadly speaks to the idea of the fact that it's really necessary to develop these sort of tools to get these methods into Earth system models, or convince people to do more work moving from Fortran to C++ or whatever.
Sam, one kind of final question about the implementation. Since there is such a push at DOE labs to utilize GPUs, is there any potential benefit or theoretical benefit to sort of offloading the neural network calculations to the GPUs. Is that something that's like somebody's looking into or not?
So there should be a benefit of running these things on GPUs, right? That's expected. I'm no longer a DOE employee, so I can kind of more safely say that I don't think anyone's working on this right now. I think it's important. I think as we move to GPUs, this will be seen if this benefit comes to pass. Something that I've been broadly frustrated by in a lot of this sort of case study land of climate and machine learning is how the benefits that you see in the case studies with advanced techniques don't always, we don't always realize them online. I remember reading papers about, increasing integration speeds by a factor of 100,000. And then you get it online and your model finishes an hour sooner, which is still great, but it's not, a microsecond like I was expecting. And I think that we'll find some of those challenges for sure.
Yeah.
Okay, well, if nobody has any other questions, thank you very much for speaking today, Sam.
Thank you.
It seems it's like really in line with like a lot of the work that people are doing here at least.
Great.
So I guess I'm still organizing a speaker for next week, or sorry, in 2 weeks, but I think we'll have somebody potentially talking about causal invariance. And then there's going to be a researcher from Stefan Ment's group who's talking in April, as well as Peter Jan. So yeah, thanks everyone for coming, and see you next time.
All right. Thank you all.
Thanks, Sam. Feeling better? All right, glad to hear it.